Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Ed Wood Summit podcast and our sister podcast, Faster Podcast Kill Kill. I haven't actually decided yet. I want to welcome Richard Rossi, and we're going to talk about Ed Wood, but we're also going to talk about his really fascinating career in the entertainment industry, as well as additional things, his fascinating career generally. And I think he's going to be able to give us some insights that do tell us a good deal about the real world of filmmaking. Not my gig, not my bag. I'm the fan. So I'm really looking forward to what Richard's going to tell me here today. And so a real super quick background. Richard and I linked up initially through a private Ed Wood Facebook page. So we're both Ed Wood fans. We're going to talk a little bit more about our affinity for Ed Wood, certainly. He's even got the shirt to prove it. Thank you, Richard. So I do want to thank you publicly right up front. I had this on the schedule for a couple of weeks now on a couple of occasions, and had other things come up at last minute. And Richard was gracious enough to push it forward on a couple of occasions to arrive at this point today. So I would just want to say that right up front, Richard. I really do appreciate your patience and understanding on that score. And so here we are, and I will turn it over to you. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, Richard.
Well, I grew up in Pittsburgh, and as you said, Greg, our affinity for Ed Wood. There was one of the all-time seminal zombie films was shot where I grew up, The Night of the Living Dead. And I was friends with some of the people involved with that.
Oh, cool.
Got to know George Romero, and a guy that I went to church with, was part of our church, was involved with that film. And I've had John Russo, the writer, on my podcast. And so I grew up like really loving this whole idea of low budget filmmaking. I think Night of the Living Dead was shot for about 68,000 or something back then in the 60s. And then there was another friend of mine, Bill Cardill, had a Saturday night horror show, two low budget films and sometimes Ed Wood films. It was called Chilly Billy Chiller's Theater. And I was kind of considered one of the tough kids that could stay up and watch Chiller Theater, because most of the kids in grade school, their parents wouldn't let them stay up to midnight or whatever. But my parents were musicians playing in the clubs on Saturdays. So me and my brothers and friends could have sleepovers and watch these low budget films. So I've always kind of like been fascinated since childhood with people that can make their art when they don't have $1 million money hose from a studio to make it. And I've always just loved indie films and low budget films. And I was working as a minister in my young adult years in Pittsburgh, my hometown. And I decided to make a film for the church at first, just as kind of an outreach to the community. And I did some kind of unique things in the film. It had a religious subject matter, but I used a soundtrack like The Who, See Me, Feel Me, Touch Me, Heal Me, different secular songs. And I kind of did it in a way that was, I guess, a little unconventional for a Christian church film. And there was a Hollywood filmmaker named Amin Q. Chaudhry from India. And he's directed some really cool independent films like Diary of a Hitman and Tiger Warsaw with Patrick Swayze and different ones. And he happened to see it because he was shooting in Pittsburgh. And he said, I think you have a really interesting, talent for filmmaking. If you're ever in Los Angeles, look me up. And he lived on Mulholland Drive by my favorite actor, Marlon Brando, and Jack Nicholson was around the corner. And so I would visit him, and he started mentoring me in this whole idea of independent filmmaking. And we were actually going to make a film together before he passed. But I kind of, as they say, I left scripture for script and started getting involved in filmmaking. And, I started to think, well, maybe art is a ministry that can, touch people's hearts more than just, preaching to the choir. So I kind of fell into filmmaking. It wasn't like something I really thought I would do as a vocation, but now I'm kind of addicted to it. Whenever I finish one, I seem to start another one.
Very cool. There's a lot there actually for me to comment upon, Richard. So I think giving up scripture for script, I think that's fascinating, because we're going to get to, I think, where the lines of convergence recently came back together, because I certainly want to talk about your film Canaan Land, which was very well received. And we're going to certainly get to Canaan Land. And I do want to say, so I forgot Night of the Living Dead shot in Pittsburgh. That's fascinating that you met Romero and John Russo. That's really fantastic. So you've been many times, I'm sure, to the Laurel Mall where they shot Dawn of the Dead, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in fact, I think Bill Cardill's daughter, I mentioned him, he had the Chilly Billy horror show. His daughter, Lori, was the lead in that film, Lori Cardill. Yeah.
Amazing, the things you learn,
Yeah.
right? That's
Yeah.
fantastic. I can picture in my head as you say that. Yeah, Dawn of the Dead, of course, actually preferential to me, even more so than Night of the Living Dead, as much as they're both
Mhm.
great movies. Um, so so Pittsburgh, yeah, and well, Pittsburgh. First off, fair to say, you talked about being on visiting your friend around Mulholland Drive, a bi-coastal existence off and on throughout your adult life. Is that fair to say?
Yes, yes, I'm definitely bi-coastal, and even more so now, because my daughter Karis is in Pittsburgh. She's been married recently, and her husband works for the Pittsburgh Pirates. So
Cool.
with possible grandchildren on the way. In fact, my
Congrats.
film before Canaan Land was about Roberto Clemente. It was called
Right.
Baseball's Last Hero, um, and so like I think it's beyond cool that my son-in-law works for the Pirates and gets me in to see free pirate games. Even though I'm
Absolutely.
the father-in-law, he's like the dad because he's taking me to baseball games and giving me pirate stuff.
Very cool. Very cool. And I read too, again, going back to that merger of those lines of convergence, the Roberto Clemente film. You also, uh, correct me if I have any of the details wrong, please, but also uh, lobbied at some point with the Pope to have Roberto Clemente made a saint,
Yeah,
correct?
yeah, I know that sounds pretty crazy.
No, it's
I,
cool, right?
I was, I was just literally laying on the bed I'm sitting on right now, kind of half awake, and I had this thought drop in my head about how, he was kind of like a Christ-like figure in the sense like he died trying to help people and trying to save people, and my film goes into that. He died trying to save earthquake victims in Nicaragua,
Mm,
flying in supplies of food and medical supplies because there was a dictator there that wasn't letting it get to the people. And so I had this idea to write to the Pope about that, then and say, why don't you make like an ordinary guy that's not a priest or a nun, that's like living large in the world, that like a really amazing example. Why don't you ever make someone like that a saint? And I remember there was a publicist for Alice Cooper that I met. Forgetting his name. He had a name. It reminded me of one of the Three Stooges. I'll come back to me. Shemp, not Shemp. I can't remember. I can't remember his name. He had a weird name, but he's like the amazing publicist, and he would do all these publicity stunts for Alice Cooper. And Gordon, something Gordon. Oh, I should Google it. But anyways, Shemp Gordon. No, someone will Google it and figure it out. But anyways, he said that when he gets those weird out of left field ideas, don't question it, just do it. Like
yeah.
one time he had an arena and he couldn't, they hardly sold any tickets, and he had a weird thought pop in his head of Alice Cooper wrapped in a snake, on the top of a van riding around the main street in London or something. And he just did it, and everyone was talking about it it sold tickets. Like sometimes these crazy ideas. So I thought, okay, I'll write to the Pope and tell him why I think Roberto Clemente is a saint. And I wrote it in Italian and in Spanish, doing my best with Google Translate and checking with Italian speakers and Spanish speakers. And lo and behold, I got a letter back from his representative, which was called the Apostolic Nunciature. And they told me to contact the Archbishop in Puerto Rico, which is where he died. They said you have to start the canonization process where he died. And then there was a big dispute in Puerto Rico over it because Clemente was kind of, I guess you'd say, like ecumenical. In other words, like he would go to different churches. So he was baptized Catholic, married in Catholic church, buried in the Catholic church. But one of his parents was Catholic and one was Baptist. He also went to a Baptist church in Puerto Rico. So the
Mhm.
Baptists that were anti-Catholic were saying he was Baptist, he's not Catholic, and they raised a big stink and scared the bishop down there that this was going to be some brouhaha. And then what's kind of funny to me is like the Washington Post sent a delegation to Rome to see if I was full of baloney or whatever. And, they talked to some secretary over there that said, I don't know anything about this. And they couldn't find anyone to verify that I've been corresponding. Now, I did post publicly some of the letters to show I was corresponding with
Right.
the Pope and stuff. But, oh, excuse me a second, drop something. But so basically the Washington Post said, we can't find any proof that he's going to be a saint, and they kind of shed some doubt on my efforts. But I thought, as a low budget guerrilla filmmaker, It's kind of funny because I had Hollywood friends that make big budget films. They called me up and they said, "Who's your bleepity bleep publicist, Richard? You know, this is in the LA Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, all but this Clemente film, which we made for nothing, with volunteer cast and crew. And now it's in all the papers talking about Clemente being the saint." So that crazy idea, it kind of gave me all this life to people talking about Clemente in the film. And I mean, in all honesty, in my heart, like, he's already a saint. Like, I mean, it'd been nice if they would do it, but in my deepest heart, I believe like he was intrinsically a great Christ-like example, whether or not, like the priests or the Catholic Church or the Pope acknowledge it. But, I'll admit, hey, it was in part a great PR thing for my film.
Sure. Right. Sure. That's a really cool story. I am, by the way, I am a lapsed Catholic. So, John, for the record, I was
we have the same childhood. Then.
Yes, I was raised Catholic. So, you're also, you mentioned, I think your dad was a jazz guitarist. You also play guitar.
Yeah, I do. In fact, I'm going to be back in 2 seconds. Just talk for 2 seconds. I'm going to grab a guitar in case that song hits me.
Cool. Very cool. And we're going to get perhaps a live performance from Richard here on the podcast, which is unexpected and wonderful. So you could see in the background as Richard's getting his guitar, the poster for Canaan Land. So again, fairly recent film we're going to talk a lot more about.
You're the best at doing dead air. Yeah. So my dad,
I'm a ham, Richard. I'm sorry. I'm a ham through
so my dad and I would play like stuff like this in the bars of Pittsburgh. We would do stuff like that. I'm confessing that I love you. Tell me, do you love me too? I'm confessing that I love you. Honest, I do. We would do a lot of stuff. So I know all these old jazz songs. Yeah.
Sure. Right. That's kind of bluesy. Also, that's real cool. And I think you mentioned to me recently, you also currently you teach guitar lessons, right? So passing along the knowledge, right?
Yes. In fact, I was teaching one of my stellar students, Kelly, yesterday. Good job. You got an A+ yesterday, Kelly.
Nice.
Through Zoom like this. This is new because of COVID. I've been doing lessons through Zoom.
Right. We've all adapted, and humans are endlessly adaptable, as we've proven here in the last year and a half. There's still maybe some challenges ahead, but we've adapted in so many ways. It's astonishing to me. So let's go into first off. So you kind of touched on it, the notion of ideas, right? Ideas taking precedence over how much money you've got to actually make something happen, and how the idea can take root and take on a whole entire life of its own, which I think has something to do, perhaps, I don't want to read into it or put words in your mouth, perhaps some of your affinity for Ed Wood may be rooted in that. I mean, personally, I don't feel dissimilar. I think of Ed, for those of you who may have watched previous podcasts, I've talked about this. I think of him as in some ways a quintessential outsider artist, who's trying to find access into an industry that he couldn't quite find the foothold that he wanted, and he had to obviously shift gears, especially in later years, to make a living and still try to find a way to pay off his innate creativity. In other words, I've said it before, do you end up starting to write for adult magazines, or do you just go drive a cab? A lot of people say, well, he hated doing what he was doing. I think he was still trying to pay off a piece of his own personal creativity, given what limited opportunities he still had available to him.
Yeah, totally. And and he had his own sexual issues. I mean, here he was in World War II, transvestite. He's wearing, women's underwear under his uniform, afraid of being discovered. So he had a double life or a secret. And, I think his writing about that and some of his stories, his film, of course, Glen or Glenda, his first film, dealt with it, but also some of his later paperbacks. It's like, art is a wonderful healer to air out the closets and to talk about things. I've worked in the church and in politics and in art, and of the three, art to me is the most honest, because in religion and politics, I found that politicians and ministers a lot of times have a certain dogma or doctrine that they have to be of service to, that their denomination believes, or their political to get votes they have to say. But in art, like Ed was able to talk about, I mean, when you look at Glen or Glenda, of course everyone laughs about it and says how it's one of the worst films, but to me, it's like amazing that he is in the 50s, talking about this secret in a sense, And there's his girlfriend, Dolores Fuller, in the film, and he's kind of like putting this all out there. I mean, like, it just blows me away.
Me too. Glenn or Glenda, absolutely. Everybody who knows me well and my affinity for Ed Wood knows how much I adore Glenn or Glenda. I think it's just a brilliant film. You can knock it, certainly, if you want to call it exploitation. You want to say that it's rough around the edges. You want to say, oh, he inserted a lot of stock footage to pad it out and for filler, and then there's stilted dialogue, and looks like one take scenes, all of that. I don't care about any of that. I care about the ultimate impact that it has on me, and it feels very much sincere. It feels very arty and in some ways experimental. And to your point, transgressive, right? Transgressive for its time. We didn't necessarily see films like that, and certainly Ed had a lot of innate passion that he was exuding throughout Glenn or Glenda. In fact, I'll go one better. I feel that the scene where he takes off or where Dolores takes off the sweater, and they clearly shot this a few times. If you watch a trailer for Glenn or Glenda, the trailer for Glenn or Glenda shows a different take of her removing the sweater and handing it to Ed. So they shot this a few times. So he was, I said one take, right? He was more deliberate with this shot. I distinctly get the impression at times in their interaction in the film that in some ways he hadn't necessarily even fully disclosed this to Dolores, except through he used the film as a vehicle to disclose it to her. I could see that look on her face where it doesn't look like acting unless she was able to immediately return to that moment when he sprang this information on her. But it seems like she's just authentically reacting at times, which I find kind of fascinating.
Yes. In fact, I heard Dolores Fuller say that one of the first takes she kind of threw the sweater in disgust at him, which is more on. She said her first take was more honest, but then she did the one where the music swells and here, I accept you, here's my sweater,
Exactly. So real quick, you mentioned Ed's Warriors. I always never miss an opportunity. My friend Jim Pontalillo, who was here a couple podcasts ago and wrote The Unknown War of Edward D. Wood Jr., one of my favorite Ed Wood books that contains Ed's whole entire military record and really demystifies great annotations by Jim throughout the record to really interrogate the record and ultimately demythologize a lot of what we know about Ed's Warriors. So I highly recommend that book. Obviously, don't want to take us off onto a huge tangent there, but anytime Ed's Warriors come up, I definitely want to recommend that as a real cornerstone of quote unquote woodology. So interestingly enough, Richard, I do consider myself a budding sort of woodologist. That's a very sort of nice way to say it, resume statement type of way of saying it, but really just a fan, right? And I like researching Ed Wood, and I'm fascinated by his career, by his work, etc. I won't go into all the details around that, but I feel at times like it is a bit of a spiritual pursuit for me. I did write an article at Ed Wood Wednesdays, and certainly for those of you watching the Ed Wood Summit podcast, you know that I hope you know I also write articles, myself and Joe Blevins, who started Ed Wood Wednesdays at his d2rights.blogspot.com, Dead to Rights blog. So definitely visit that. We've published a ton of articles.
I've really enjoyed some of the articles you've written there, Greg. I've enjoyed your blog and some of your articles there, Greg.
Thank you. Yeah, me and Joe kind of take somewhat dissimilar approaches sometimes when we write articles. I tend to get into real specialized sort of ephemera, and Joe is very thorough into giving us everything known on a given subject. Although I've noted recently, Joe's going to hate me for saying this, but I've noted recently in some of his articles, he's leaning in the direction of some highly ephemeral topics. So that being said, we've been at this now for 400 plus articles over the last handful of years. So we're digging deep, to say the least, into all aspects of Ed Wood. But one thing again, a bit of a spiritual pursuit, it feels like to me personally. That being said, there was, and I don't know a lot about it, this is not something I've researched, but since we're on this subject, there was a Church of Ed Wood. Do you know anything about that? A group that considered themselves a Church of Ed Wood?
Yeah, I did hear about that, and I thought it was really interesting. It's kind of like their credo was, to kind of be yourself, do what you want to do, and even if you're an outcast. And I thought it was really fascinating. And Al Doshna, our mutual friend, who's an associate producer on my film Canaan Land, Al wrote some articles that talked about the spiritual aspect of. He used the example Plan 9 and how people put him down as being the worst film, but how it turned out so great. Like that's a film, like I've watched it scores of times and it's gotten all this attention. And he made the point like of grace. The theological concept of grace is like that we're accepted and loved by God, as we are. And that,
Right.
a lot of times like conservative kind of fundamentalist Christians are very judgmental and self-righteous. And the Bible
Right.
itself like talks about all kind of stuff about humanity and the stories and all the, the different failures and crazy things people do. But there's a sense with Ed Wood that like, even though people judged him as bad, it all kind of turned out good, which is kind of like the message of grace that, we're saved by grace and forgiven and everything. And so Al wrote about that as well, that there's like, to me, like there's a very spiritual side to Ed a lot of people don't know. Like, for example, the
Right.
minister in Plan 9, he was very close. Like when he was troubled and depressed, he'd call that guy, Reverend Len Lemon, up in the middle of the night and, pray with him. And, of course, there's the great story about being baptized and joining the church.
Yeah.
And in fact, I've been to that church a few times, First Baptist in Beverly Hills on Cynthia
Oh,
Drive.
wow.
And
Cool.
yeah, and there's some old timers there that remember all that. But Ed, after that that spiritual experience, sent out these Christmas cards that I love, where he put on the Jesus wig and grew the beard, and it was Ed is Jesus. And also the whole Plan 9 thing, when he was looking for a name for the bomb, he was paging through the Bible in the book of Revelation and looking for some weird prophetic name. And I think Kathy Wood, I think his wife may have claimed that she came up with a solar benite bomb.
I've heard that. I've heard that.
Yeah, but there's a very kind of, there's a, Ed was to me like a really, there's a lot of spirituality to somebody that's like the world perceives as broken or a failure. Like that's, to me, like that's like who the real Jesus went to. He was a friend of the sinners and the fallen and the broken. And,
Right.
it's kind of sad there's been this identity theft in our society today where so many Christian people are so judgmental. I mean, like Ed would be the type of person a lot of Christians would probably judge for his, problems and,
Right.
damn to hell. But to me, I find like so much grace and beauty in him and his work.
Very cool. I love that viewpoint. Again, perhaps lapsed Catholic, but it feels like a spiritual pursuit to me. And again, you said a lot that I want to quickly comment on. Yeah, so raised, I believe, in a United Methodist church. His parents were married in a United Methodist church, and I believe that was his mother's denomination. And she was, to my understanding, a regular churchgoer. I don't know how much religion might have played a role in the family, but what I do know from a newspaper article, Richard, that was written after he got out of the war, he went back home to Poughkeepsie, and Edward D. Jr. is noted in a newspaper article, and it's the only evidence I've ever found of this, as the chaplain of the Veteran of Foreign Affairs Office. Veteran of Foreign, and I'm kind of like, he didn't obviously serve very long. He hit the road again and started to make his way ultimately to Hollywood. And there's a nebulous period around 1947 where a lot of different things attributed to Ed's activity. He joined the Carney. He went to college in Philadelphia. He danced with the Marcia Graham troupe and learned dancing from Marcia Graham, which I think, and that one, some of these things sound incredulous, and you're kind of like, there's no proof of these things. It's not documented. So we're hearing sort of stories third hand or perhaps made up out of whole cloth. But that part, going back to Glen or Glenda really quickly, when we get into the nightmare sequences in Glen or Glenda, Glen's nightmares, the physical symbolism, the acting, it looks a little bit like the kind of symbolism you'll see in Marcia Graham pieces. I know that sounds crazy to even say, but
well, then the choreography in that is so from the subconscious. It feels like a nightmare where they're all pointing judgmentally at him. And again, like I think to me, like if he was a chaplain, he's someone I would actually be comfortable talking to about my problems or asking for spiritual help, because somebody like Ed Wood, who was so judged and marginalized, he knows what it feels like to be judged, or he was judged for his personal life. He was judged for his films. So somebody like that, if they are a sensitive person, they have a lot of compassion for other people that are judged and marginalized. So like, to me, I think he would have been a really good chaplain if he pursued it. And also, I have the same feeling, like those images of the nightmare sequence there, where they're all pointing at him, and the devil comes out,
Yeah.
and who was the guy that owned a local strip club here in Hollywood, played that part. And I don't know, they're so from the subconscious. There's so much like archetype, and the choreography is very much like Martha Graham. They're surrounding him with pointed fingers, you know.
Right. Right.
It just, to me, it's really, yeah, I know, it's really powerful stuff. It's really like from the subconscious stuff, you know.
It really is. In that moment when Dolores starts to come onto the scene during the nightmare sequence, she has her hands out in front of her, and it's very much like the way Vampira walks through the graveyard in Plan
Yeah,
9.
yeah.
So they're not accidents, folks. These are very deliberate directorial choices. You may think like he's just a cheap exploitation director who's just filming these one take things, but these are not accidents in my mind. He's got a deliberate artistic vision that trumps in every way whatever kind of limitations he was working against. I wanted to give a shout out, Richard. You mentioned Al Doshna, and I didn't realize until I was doing a little prep work for our conversation. I flicked on a YouTube watch party for Canaan Land.
Oh yeah.
And there was, all the fun. We're going to get to Canaan Land. I really do want to get to that. But in the middle of the screen, I'm looking and I was like, that gentleman looks like Al Doshna. And then you subsequently told me, yeah, he's the associate producer on Canaan Land. So for you folks in the Ed Wood universe, you probably know Al, and I want to give him a shout out for it. Also maintains a Facebook page devoted to Conrad Brooks, and he has been furiously at work, to my understanding, on Conrad's memoir. We're going to talk a little bit because you spoke to Conrad Brooks and have some more to say about that. So we're going to get to that as well. But I want to give a shout out to Al for being an Ed supporter and fan for far longer than I. I mean, he worked on the Plan 9 Companion, I believe, or was it the Haunted World? I believe it was the Plan 9 Companion.
Yeah, he also was an associate producer on Haunted World.
Haunted World, right?
Jr. Yes, and he also was involved with finding some of Ed's early shorts, like the ones Laredo, Crossroads of Laredo,
Right.
and some of that stuff. I'm drawing a blank, but he became friends with a gentleman who was Ed's early partner.
John Crawford Thomas?
That was it. Yeah, John
Right.
Crawford Thomas. Him and Al were friends. He's since passed, but him and Al were friends in restoring some of those early shorts of Edward D. Wood Jr.
Right, right. We've gone down a track here on Ed spirituality. So real quick, it makes me think of a couple things. I could see, over your shoulder, the Canaan Land poster. So I see a crucifix, and it makes me think the crucifix is in the graveyard. It makes me think in Crossroads of Laredo, there's a burial scene, and we see the casket.
Yes.
Death ends up being a very big preoccupation for Ed in every way.
Yes, very much so. He was afraid and worried about death, and to me, he like puts a lot of those childlike fears out there on the screen, and he's so inventive. He in the Crosswords of Laredo, he didn't have like a coffin prop, so he got like it's an old cardboard box and spray painted it and aged it. And I relate to him because like in Canaan Land, there's a scene where my character, Brother Billy, he fakes a resurrection. This is me, Brother Billy, which is the poster back there, but. And I fake a resurrection of that I'm raising this guy from the dead. But I was doing this on a shoestring and didn't have a coffin either. And I went to the funeral homes, and these coffins are pretty expensive. And I ended up just getting pretty much an Ed Wood trick. I mean, we literally had like a cheap cardboard coffin that we did the same thing. We just try to make it look as good as we could.
Sure. Actually, I think that coffin in Crossroads of Laredo looks like it's about maybe 2/3 the size of an actual human being. So it reminds me a little bit, the scene in Sunset Boulevard where they bury the monkey out in the yard, right? The very tiny coffin.
Yeah.
It's a little ghoulish perhaps, and perhaps that's fitting. So Ed Wood. So let's jump in. We mentioned Al. Al, I also noted, was in the Kelton the Cop episode that you were in. I believe it's episode 4 in the Kelton the Cop series. So tell us, please, Richard, a little bit about how you got involved in that, first off, and a little bit about the Kelton the Cop series itself for those who may not be familiar with it.
Yeah, well, Paul Marco, as you know, very sweet man. He was a very dear friend of Ed's, and he was, I think, one of the only ones in the whole trilogy of Plan 9 Bride of the Munster and Night of the Ghouls as Calton the cop. And he was kind of a goofy cop that was bumbling, kind of like a Lou Costello or a Barney Fife type of vibe. And just a good friend of Ed's. A lot of, once again, a person who had compassion and acceptance for Ed and all of Ed's idiosyncrasies. Right. And maybe in part because he was another person who would have been judged at the time for being a gay man at the time. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but
sure
but anyways, yeah, thanks to Al, I got more involved with the Kelton project, and I was the zombie mayor, which was fun. And there's a, to me, I feel proud to have this kind of, in a weird sense, to be an actor in the lineage of Ed, in the sense of, Paul Marco was one of the most used actors by Ed, along with Conrad Brooks, probably also. Then you had like Duke Moore was in several, I think, as an inspector, but Paul was in that kind of stock company. And so to be a part of being associated with his Count the Cop in the later films before he died, I feel really, really proud of that. I mean, I just love all those people in his universe. It's just, people put them down as like Hollywood bottom fish or whatever, but I relate to them because, I'm trying to do the same thing outside of millions of dollars in the studio system. And anybody that gets a film made on, by hook or by crook, I mean, Ed Wood, as much as everyone puts him down, I mean, he made like about 7 or 8 feature films. I guess I'm not counting the later adult stuff as much, but like 7, I don't know if we'd say mainstream, but 7 films that you could show on like Chili Billy's Chiller Theater back in the day, Plan 9, Bride of the Munster, Night of the Ghouls, Sinister Urge, Glen or Glenda, I'm forgetting one. I think the one with the face that they changed with Steve Reeves, I'm thinking.
Yeah, Jailbait.
Yeah, so there's about 7, I think, that I just named right there. But like, hey, he got 7 films done, which like, not putting down the Medveds or anybody else, but the people that like have given him some fame and infamy and saying how bad his films were, I don't think they've made 7 feature films,
Correct. Very much so. I don't remember ever seeing the name Medved in the tail end of the credits of a feature film. So yeah, it's easy to criticize, right? And it's very easy to criticize. As human beings, we unfortunately can go that road in myriad ways. Unrelated to even criticizing somebody who made films on a low budget. So other Crossroads of Laredo, there were other TV shorts, certainly scripts he wrote during that era. But I just thought of the association, it struck me, people generally refer to those 6 films from Glen or Glenda through Sinister Urge, the 6 films that he wrote and directed, as the canonical Ed Wood films, which is kind of, again, an interesting association given the conversation that we're having. But yeah, he did subsequently make a few more features. But yeah, that's when he goes off into the adult industry in later years. So I think Kelton the Cop, let's go back to Paul Marco and Kelton the Cop really quickly. So I've seen episodes of that series, and certainly it's different, right? I thought of, when I watched it, I thought of, if anybody's familiar with Chris Marker's La Jetée, a French film from the early 1960s, a short film, which is composed of still images with voiceover over it, which is how the Kelton the Cop series is constructed, which is different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting too that it emerged from Europe. I believe the director's from Russia, I think, and and they've shown it in kind of like nightclubish venues in Europe, and it's I wish Paul could have lived a little bit longer, because there was a resurgence. At least Paul got to live for some of the resurgent interest in Ed. Unfortunately, Ed passed, as you know, in I think 78, so he died just before there was a revival of interest, but unfortunately. But Conrad Brooks and Paul Marco and like Gregory Walcott, who's another sweet man that I got to know. All these people got to at least get back in the sunshine a little bit and have people do some revival events and screenings of Plan 9, and I think it's really cool that Paul Marco got to be a part of all that.
Very much so. So that's interesting. You know, all these guys. This is fascinating. So you mentioned earlier, Captain Zeta plays the devil, of course,
Yes.
and
Yes.
his real name is William de Orgler. I haven't written I'm going to write a lengthy article about Captain Zeta. I've written a
Oh,
few
that'll
articles
be
about a
interesting.
couple articles about him, but I'll write a very lengthy article. So yeah, you mentioned running a strip joint. I know that he was also a talent agent for uh, strippers, and he did many other things. So much more to come on Captain Zeta. But yeah,
Yeah.
he is in the space of mere seconds, and it's not only the great makeup by I believe Harry Thomas, but it's certainly his piercing eyes and just his demeanor. In mere
Yeah.
seconds, he's able to immediately cut through everything and immediately command the screen in his portrayal of not only the devil, but interestingly enough, later in the film, he plays the father of
Yes.
Glenn, and he's
Yes.
only a couple seconds of screen time where he's sort of at the bar belting back a drink and presumably, you know, full of hot air, that kind of guy, not really the kind of guy who Glenn would think warmly of. And Ed gives you perhaps a little insight into Ed's thoughts about his own father, having the same guy portray him and the devil, right?
Yeah. 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 Like there's a lot of speculation as to Ed's sexual issues. A lot of people try to theorize. I guess my perspective is like I'm no psychiatrist, only
Yeah,
God knows all the reasons for everything. But like, I've wondered that too. Like he talks in Glenn or Glenda, the coldness of the father who was embarrassed that his son wasn't more masculine or whatever.
right,
And then the mother, I mean, I've heard those tales, as you probably have, that the mother dressed him as a girl when he was little. I think Dolores Fuller might have said that he had confided that she wanted a girl and would dress him up in dresses and things like that. So,
right,
yeah, it's interesting, like to make such a personal film and to try to explore his issues. Again, to me, that's like a true artist. Like Ed Wood is never just, I mean, like his first film, he just throws it all on the screen there. I mean, like
right,
even today, someone with those kind of issues hides it. Like, I had an uncle that was Ed Woodian in that way and transvestite, and he also was a very powerful man, and in the world sense of his job and everything like that. And it was like a super hidden thing, that we didn't talk
right.
about too much behind closed doors. And so, like in the 50s, for Ed Wood to be like saying, to be making these kind of films and putting it out there and even speculating about the issues with the father, it's like, it's profound. I feel like he was really ahead of his time. I mean, this is way before books like on codependency were coming out, or books on, this is way before, like, I mean, think about this, is like 30 years before Rock Hudson was forced to be outed by having AIDS, and Liberace. I mean, this is like, I mean, it's just amazing to me that he's even speculating in Glenn or Glenda a little bit there about, I wonder if my father and the coldness there had effect on my issues.
Right. That's a really interesting topic, and certainly Ed in the LGBTQ community today is to some degree championed. He's not derided like a lot the Medved viewpoint. I shouldn't say that. It's the golden turkey viewpoint, not to
Yeah,
ascribe it strictly to them, but that he's some kind of laughable or derisive figure because he
yeah,
likes to wear women's clothes. That's really it's a preposterous notion. Um, to me, but it still obtains in some Ed Wood sort of viewpoint that you'll find in today's world. Yeah, he's just that quirky, funny guy who like to wear women's clothes. I think it's an extremely, extremely complicated subject, Ed's
yeah.
sexuality, and I plan on, so you guys know, at some point down the road, bringing a panel on to share their viewpoint on it. And
Oh,
so I'm
that would
not.
be interesting.
Yeah, I don't want to go there today, but that could be a controversial Ed Wood podcast summit to some people, because there are those who ascribe entirely to sort of what I consider, I'm giving away a little bit of my punchline right now, Richard, ascribing a little bit to the myth that he was heterosexual, 100% straight through and through. He was attracted to women, just like to wear women's clothes. So
Mhm.
I've given you again a little bit of insight into perhaps my viewpoint differing a bit from that, and I have reasons to believe so, but I don't want to get off on that tangent because that'll be another subject for another day. There's so many things. This is what's fascinating about Ed Wood. You can talk to somebody who is also very interested in Ed Wood, and we're talking about substantial uh, things, right? We're talking about religion and sexuality, and we're talking about socio sociocultural changes over vast expanses of time. We're talking about art and art on a shoestring. So Ed is really, and to me, and very much a nexus point for a vast, rich world of conversation that people can have around his work.
Hmm. Yes, yes, and it's interesting he's so discussed and thought about now compared to like for instance, my film Canaan Land is like a modern version of a film. Well, it's like my character is very Elmer Gantry-ish,
Hmm.
like the 1960 Burt Lancaster film. And you look at the director of that film, Richard Brooks, who won a bunch of Oscars and made all these critically acclaimed films like In Cold Blood and Elmer Gantry and different ones that had him like considered, the pinnacle of a great literary writer director. And yet, Ed Wood's probably much more known than Richard Brooks,
Right.
like it's kind of interesting. And again, getting back to Al Doshna's point about the grace of God, where like the person looked down upon ends up being elevated, the one that
Right.
is humbled ends up exalted.
For sure. I mean, just I spend an inordinate amount of my free time writing about Ed Wood, researching Ed Wood, and I enjoyed it immensely. Could Ed Wood have ever imagined? Could he have, in his most wildest imaginings in the last few years of his life, could he have imagined that a little over a decade later, Johnny Depp would be playing him in a big budget Hollywood film? That there would be decades later people who were devoting a great deal of their time and effort to sort of
Mm.
trying to keep his memory alive and to try to resurrect new details about the work that he did. I don't think he could have possibly fathomed
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. I mean, you think about the end of his life there. I've been to the his last apartment there in Yucca,
Wow.
and the liquor store there.
Yeah.
And sometimes I've stopped there and I've kind of got a little misty-eyed looking at his apartment and thinking about how they kicked him out and evicted him, and just could only take what he could carry with him. And I've looked across the street there to the liquor store, and he would shuffle back and forth and get his bottle of booze. And then also I lived near Peter Coe, where Peter Coe lived. It was on Laurel Canyon where Ed died. Peter Coe was kind enough to take Ed Wood and his wife Kathy into his apartment when they were homeless.
Right.
And I live the next street over, that runs north and south. There's Laurel Canyon and then Whitsett. I'm on Whitsett, and I'm actually not far numerically from where Peter's place was. So I mean, I literally could walk to and I've that last apartment there, and I've seen it where he died. And yeah, it wasn't that old. I mean, he was younger than I am now,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. 54. Yeah.
yeah. So
That's
yeah, it's kind of sad because I don't think he could have imagined all the good
no,
things around the corner.
no, for sure. You've said so much in the course of this conversation, Richard. I certainly hope we'll continue to pursue
Yeah,
dialogue around a lot of these items because
yeah,
Gregory Walcott, as example, Gregory Walcott for a long time sort of pushed off, my involvement in that film. I was not a big
yeah,
fan of that. And he came around in later years to understand that, well, this was something
yeah.
that I did and something that people still gravitate towards. Then you mentioned, this is totally off topic, but the geography. I'm in northeastern Pennsylvania. I've
Uh-huh.
never been to Hollywood. So I know
Well,
that
if you ever come out, Greg, and you need someone to take you to these key Ed Wood sites, I'd be happy to be your tour guide.
if I ever get there, I will absolutely take you up on
Yeah,
that because I'd love
yeah,
to see these places. You mentioned Playboy Liquors, certainly the last apartment on Yucca,
yeah.
and yeah, Peter Coe's apartment on Laurel Canyon. So well, we'll talk about this offline because this is going way far afield. But Laurel Canyon, is that's in the vicinity of like Wonderland Ave, right, where the Wonderland murders happened. John Holmes ultimately was charged with the Wonderland murders,
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
recall that story.
there's a lot of history here, and
Right, right.
yeah, yeah, it's amazing. Like I have my own little kind of Ed Wood tour because I know the history and I know the spots, and
Yeah,
I probably could be a guy and get a van and do tours because sometimes I do it. I did it for my sister. Wanted me on one Halloween to do my own little tour like that, and I
that's
did it
really
for her.
cool.
Yeah, but yeah, there's thank God for Peter Coe. I mean, that to me is like a true Christian person to take someone in,
Yeah,
when in that kind of a moment where he has nowhere to go, and it's just heartbreaking because they probably threw out a lot of stuff that would have been precious
right.
memorabilia to us now. When they evicted Ed and Kathy.
Yeah, I think that was potentially where a lot of stuff got lost. I think they had a storage shed, and
Okay.
one of their pieces of luggage, the same set of luggage. So there's two suitcases, from my understanding, and one Ed and Kathy were able to take with them, and Kathy ultimately ended up with that. And so the Hollywood Rat Race manuscript, as example,
Yeah.
the script for I Woke Up Early the Day I Died, those were in that suitcase, and
Wow.
they wouldn't have otherwise survived. There was an alternate suitcase that was in a storage shed, and that made its way over time into the hands of an Ed Wood collector, and that included things like a scrapbook of Ed's and many other day-to-day items. But yeah, sadly, to your point, Richard, I think vast majority of his belongings uh, fell to the wayside over time. He moved a
Mhm.
few times over the course of the last, well, throughout his whole adult life when he was in Hollywood. Let's put it that way. He's not in any place for a great period of time before he moves to another apartment. And
Yeah.
in some ways, his apartments are downgrading over time, as
Yeah.
his alcoholism, as his disease is progressing. I kind of see those things as happening concurrently. So he did have in the 60s, he had a house with a pool in the backyard, not even remotely the case when he's living in that last apartment um,
Hmm.
on Yucca Street. So yeah, vast changes in a short period of time for him. Um,
Yeah.
so we'll go back to Paul Marco here. So yeah, Paul's in the Celt and the Cop series, and yeah, one of many interesting figures in sort of the Ed Wood orbit who were friends of his and appeared in a number of his works. So let's jump off on that point to Conrad Brooks. So you
Hmm.
mentioned to me you've talked to Conrad, and
Yeah.
certainly knowing Al, I'm sure you know other details about Conrad. I'll be honest, Conrad, I've talked to a handful of other people. Conrad made a lot of independent films in the 90s, and made them
Yeah.
with a lot of independent filmmakers, very low budget films. And he was very active on kind of the convention circuit, signing autographs and things like that. And I've had very polarizing views of Conrad. Somebody like Al, of course, had a very warm relationship with him, but I've heard other people that worked with him talked about him in somewhat disparaging terms, like he was a little bit hard to get along with. I don't know what your personal interaction with him was like and to what extent it was, if you want to expand on that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I can understand the dichotomy. I mean, like on the positive side, I think he had a lot of compassion for Ed, and he tried to be there for him and everything. And he would visit him down there on Yucca Street, and he goes all the way back with him. And we have a similar background. Like he was from the Eastern United States, and just
Right.
I don't know, he just has a certain sensibility and vibe that reminds me of guys I grew up with. I think like my impression with him towards the end, we've talked on the phone a few times, was I think he might have been like sick or desperate for money. And I think that contributed to his being a little prickly at times,
Sure.
because like this is just my speculation, but I think like there's a weird vibe like when you're known, but like people outside of Hollywood assume like if you're known in the arts or film, they assume you're set for life. Like that's like how people I grew up with, like they think I'm super rich, and there's people that have put on the internet that I'm worth millions of dollars and everything because they've seen my films, my
All
DVDs and my
right.
films in the blockbusters or whatever, and they have like no idea that distributors didn't pay me my royalties or anything like that. And like, well, as an example, in the 50s on local television here in Los Angeles was two movie shows. One was Vampira, of course, the horror hostess, who was like Chilly Billy when I grew up in Pittsburgh. And then also there was a woman that showed love story movies named Voluptua, who
Right.
was friends with Vampira, and her son Jefferson's a friend of mine. And Jefferson came to a ministry I'd started out here for actors and filmmakers called Eternal Grace. And so when she was dying, Voluptua asked me to come be with her at the nursing. It was kind of a private nursing home facility, and pray with her there. But to make a long story short, Vampira in her later years was like really didn't have food and money and stuff. And like
Yeah.
I remember Voluptua, Jefferson's mother, Gloria was her real name, making some casseroles and saying, "Hey, let's take this over," and we just leave it on the doorway there for Vampira because we didn't want her to feel
Yeah.
embarrassed they're ashamed that we were dropping food off there, So I say all that to say, like, Conrad was kind of in that place where he was famous for being in the Ed Wood orbit, but he was kind of like desperate for money, because that kind of shocked me, like, because he had asked me for money towards the end of his life, and that shocked me that he was like, I don't know, it just kind of shocked me because I was trying to help him and publicize him, and it just kind of shocked me that he was that I don't want to say mercenary, but it came off that way. So I think I think that might have contributed to it, that like all of a sudden there's this Ed Wood resurgence, and there's certainly like money to be made, like, but like he's not making it. I don't know. I'll give you an example. I have this jacket. It's right to my right. I'll be right back in 1 second.
Sure.
This particular jacket, that was the jacket I wore in Canaan Land, is gold glitter jacket. And it comes out of my character being this faith healer who claims that, the golden streets of heaven hit my jacket and turn it gold, and that I would call down gold glitter on people. In fact, I can put it on while I'm talking about it. In fact, Ed Wood, Al Dawson had got a copy of it in that watch party you've seen. He actually got one. So I'll put it on my jacket. But here's the thing. It started this fashion trend. And if you Google Richard Rossi gold jacket, Brother Billy jacket, it's being sold all over the world in all these stores. And it's saying I created this gold glitter trend, right? But here's the thing. They're using my face, my name, and they're like selling this thing for like $150 to $200. And they never asked my permission. I never got a cent from it. And of course, lawyers are saying we can stop this. But, Canaan Land's a guerrilla film. I don't have like a studio with a PR budget. So I haven't been like a fighter, like shutting it down, because I'm thinking, well, they're giving me all this free publicity. In fact, Al shocked me in the watch party. He had bought one through one of these stores, and he in the watch party, Al has it on, and like he pops up with it on, and it's like, I got my Billy jacket. But like, so people, like, I have people I went to kindergarten and grade school with calling me up, your jacket's like sold all over the place. It's like a big item. And they're like, hey, my husband's out of work. I went to kindergarten with you. Like, they think like I'm have all this money and I haven't got 1 cent off of the sales, right? But if you Google Brother Billy Richard Rossi Canaan Land jacket, it's like, it's amazing how many places are selling this with my face and a display of me in the jacket, right? Like from this image, right?
Yeah,
right
for
there.
sure.
I'm getting a glare, but that's kind of like Conrad. Like, I got that impression. I think, like, to me, I saw both sides. He was really nice and we had great talks, but then he said, I'd like to come on your podcast. Now, I've been interviewed on many podcasts, and I've also have a Blog Talk Radio podcast, and I had a radio show on terrestrial 101.5 FM, and like I've had like Oscar winners and Oscar nominees on, and like no one's ever like tried to shake me down for money. They all realize like coming on a podcast is good. It promotes you. It lets people know about you, and no one, like, it doesn't even enter my consciousness that someone would want to be paid for that, right? Because I mean, you're promoting them, right? And so like Conrad, one of my last interactions with him was, he said, I'll come on your podcast, but then he was like wanting me to pay him all this money to do it. And I was kind of shocked, it kind of put me back, like, I mean, like, I didn't say this to him. I was very kind about it. I said, okay, well, I thought, well, he must need money. I said, okay, well, maybe I'll come up with some money and we'll set a date. And then he passed away and we never did it. But I was thinking to myself, like, I've had like Academy Award A-list actors on my radio show, and they don't ask for money. Like, it just like, like he had the attitude, like, I don't know, I think he must have been desperate. So like, I don't know. I think there's like, I don't know him as well as Al, and I love the man. We had great conversations. I don't mean to disparage him, but I don't know. I think that might be one of the things that rubs people the wrong way, is I think, like, I'm not saying it in a judgy way, but I think he maybe tried to exploit the Ed Wood Association financially. And, I don't know. It just, to me, like, he didn't seem to understand the ethos or the ethics of it. Like interviews are something you do to promote you, and you shouldn't be trying to shake down the host,
Right. I think it aligns with what my understanding is of people who do maybe take a more disparaging view of Conrad, that he was, would get in people's face at conventions and things like that, trying to hawk his wares, trying to push autographs off on them to make a buck and things like that. And I find it's sad, of course, right? I certainly find it sad. That being said, Richard, so everybody knows, in full disclosure, I have agreed to pay you $5,000 for this podcast. Correct?
We had a confidentiality agreement about
Sorry,
that.
I broke the NDA. So I guess now you can take me to court. I'm joking, of course.
Well,
to your point, obviously, yeah, you wouldn't.
Well, maybe Conrad saw these. Maybe Conrad saw these lies on the internet. Like
right.
There's lies out there that my net worth is like $30 million. So maybe he saw
I did
that.
see that. I did see things like that when I was doing a little bit of research. I did note that on some pages that you're worth millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah.
So the coat alone, of course, is worth millions of dollars. I got to get one. I really got to get one. I'm glad. I'm glad it sparked some interest. It reminded me, of course, when I first saw it, the gold lame suit, Elvis's famous gold lame suit.
It's funny you say that. That's where I got the idea. Was I'm a huge Elvis fan, and in fact, his last fiance, who found him when he passed, is in Canaan Land, Ginger Alden, who's a lovely, lovely actress and lovely person. That's I also got the idea from Liberace. My mother was a piano teacher and loved Liberace, and we went when I was a little boy. She took me to meet him and see him perform.
Oh,
and
cool.
Also Josie Pollock, one of my closest friends, who's also plays one of the main roles in Canaan Land. She toured for years with Liberace. Her and her husband were his opening act. Her husband, Channing Pollock, was a magician that did the Dove Act. And her and Liberace were really close friends. So I had that Elvis Liberace thing. And then there was a church out here in California that was conning people with this fake miracle where the pastor claimed gold dust from heaven was falling in their services. And he put a craft store gold glitter, plastic little gold glitter from in the HVAC system, and it blowed around. He says, "Oh my God, there it is!"
That's brilliant. That's brilliant.
He charged people. After that, people were just giving this guy thousands of dollars.
Wow, that's really cool.
That got in my head.
So real quick, the designer of the gold lame suit, I love one of my favorite designers. So, and you may know this, Richard, but Nudie Cohen. So Nudie Cohen started out designing even things like G-strings and lingerie and the burlesque circuit in the 1930s. But eventually he started doing, think about his typical style more so than the gold lame suit, which of course became iconic and I think became one of the highest selling at auction pieces of celebrity clothing ever auctioned off. Elvis's original gold lame suit. I think there were actually two of them. But in any case, Nudie Cohen, more so known for the embroidered Western jackets. Everybody from Roy Rogers to Kenny Duncan all wore Nudie Cohen suits. With
and if you come here, we'll add it to the tour, because the house that he lived in and made these out of in North Hollywood is literally a stone's throw from here also. And it's by the library. It's right by the Studio City Library, where I'm a library hound. I'm probably the best known person of the librarians there. I'm always in there getting new books. But he lived right around the corner from the library here, and he made them out of his house in North Hollywood. And he also made the great suit Elvis wore in Aloha from Hawaii, which is one of his most iconic looks.
Right. Very cool. Yeah. So if I do get out to the West Coast, if I've managed to get there, Richard, I'm going to totally take you up on that. In fact, we'll drag a camera along with us. We'll do a little guerrilla documentary.
If I still have my red Jeep from Canaan Land, there's a famous car in my Brother Billy drives this red Jeep. And I had an acting job this week, and I drove the red Jeep to the set, and I came in and I didn't expect the reaction. People's like, "That's Brother Billy."
Right.
Because they recognized it from the movie, I could take you for a tour in Brother Billy's Jeep, and we can go to where he made
that would be great.
Outfits, and we can take you to Peter Coe's apartment and go down to Yucca to Ed's last apartment. And of course, we got to go to Western and Santa Monica Quality Studios where Plan 9 was shot. That's
for sure. I'll talk to you offline. I'll send you an email offline about that exact addresses, because there's some location stuff that a few of my friends have been working on.
Yeah,
so Western and Santa Monica, right? And then okay, I won't go off on a huge tangent.
Yeah, and you got to kind of go down an alley to get there, and sometimes it's locked. You almost got to luck out when someone has that unlocked to get down that alley and get in there.
Right. It was a bar / strip joint for quite a while. And then it recently got remodeled a couple of years ago. It got remodeled into, I believe, a recording studio. Right.
Yeah. In fact, I was in there when they were doing some recording, and Gold Diggers Lounge. In fact, I think the guy that played the devil in Glenda might have been, I don't know if that was one of the places that he owned. I'm not sure, but he owned a strip joint. It might have been.
Maybe. Well, he died actually in 1954, I believe. Captain DeZita. But the original owner of Quality Studio, well, maybe somebody else owned the building prior to that, but the owner of Quality Studios at the time had shot Glenda, and he had been for a handful of years at that point, was a director named W. Merle Connell, who is genuinely ascribed to be the gentleman who shot the kind of exploitation strip whipping scenes in Glenda. And he was a director himself, but he often shot girls who danced at the LA Follies at Quality, as well as even earlier on shot right on stage at the Follies. But obviously partnered with George Weiss on Glenda. George produced it, and that's why I want to talk a little bit about the locations, because my understanding is George had an office in that vicinity of Quality Studios. So that was something that a friend of mine was actually trying to nail down this precise address. So I'll definitely hit you up to try to nail that down. I have some pictures that he sent me from back in the early 70s of that geography, and many of the same buildings are there, and you likely you'll be able to identify it. So let's make our way up now to Canaan Land, but I want to start. So yes, you have a lengthy, certainly IMDb page with all kinds of fascinating credits on it over a very lengthy span of time. I want to jump Canaan Land we'll get to. Let's go back from A until we get to Z. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood? That's astonishing. I grew up obviously on that show.
Yeah. Well, my father was the first musical director there, and he, we were a large Catholic family. I'm the oldest of 5 kids, and Mr. Rogers was a saint. In fact, his son said it was like being raised by Jesus. So, but he didn't pay. He was like a low budget director. People don't make money. Betty Aberlin's a friend of mine who was Lady Aberlin, and she worked for years for him, and a lot of these people just did it almost like a calling. So my dad couldn't continue there with 5 kids to feed. So he got out of there pretty early on, and a guy took over who was a great jazz pianist named Johnny Costa. But I did have the privilege as a kid of being on set there, in the land of make-believe. There's nothing like that. And, I got to be on set and, was filmed with Mr. McFeely and Mr. Rogers doing some things. I don't think, I've been trying to find the footage of that, and I can't really find it, but I did have the privilege as a kid of being there on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in the land of make-believe and everything. And, growing up in Pittsburgh, that was, I think it was before he blew up into a big national figure. I'm not sure when he got known to the larger world, but I think my recollection and feeling was as a boy that it was more of a local thing at WQED Channel 13 there.
Right. Now you're talking about, I think 1969 is the credit has you. I was born in 1968. So by the time I have my earliest memories, we're probably talking about 1972, 1973 or so. And so I remember by that time the show having gone national. And so, that was you had every child of that era's dream come true to travel to the magical land of make-believe for certain.
Yeah, he was very nurturing to me too. My father, I love my father dearly, and I can play guitar because he was such a great guitar player, and I played in the bars with him as a kid, but he was bipolar. And so if he was off his meds or drinking alcohol with his meds, he could be abusive. And if I made a mistake or lost the rhythm, I was in big, big trouble, and I'd really get it without going into a litany of how bad that was. I was like desperate for like a nurturing male figure, father figure. So like to me, I guess the best way I can say it is that Mr. Rogers said the kind of things to all of us as children that we needed our parents to say sometimes, but maybe their own brokenness, they couldn't give what they didn't have. But he was to know how to say those things like you're special and I love you just for you. It's not the clothes you wear. It's not the way you do your hair. Well, he had a song. It was something like, maybe I'll do a riff of it. I think it was something like, it's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the way you do your hair. It's you I like. What's the next word? I don't know. I can't remember, but it's something like that. But he just had a way of saying those things we needed to hear.
He came across, of course, as Yes, so certainly nurturing is precisely the right word for it, and such a such a sincere. We talked about judgment, right? There's certainly no
Mhm.
judgment in Mr. Rogers's universe, not whatsoever. So that's a great first
No,
credit for
no.
one's IMDb page, having been on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, to my mind. So move ahead a little bit. Again, I'll put some links into the description box here, so you can check out some more of all the things, all the wonderful things that Richard has done. But let's jump ahead a few years, because I personally watched this movie when I was probably about 11 years old, and it was on pay cable when pay cable was still a fairly new thing all the time. And the movie wasn't a big box office hit or anything. But to
Mhm.
me, as an 11 or 12-year-old, I think you know what film I'm going to ask you about. It was absolutely uproarious, and I watched the film over and over and over again. It was shot in your hometown of Pittsburgh.
Oh yeah.
If people remember the film, The Fish That Saved Pittsburgh.
Yeah, well, it's amazing you remember you've really done your homework. Yeah. Yeah, I was 16 and I just remember being so happy I got to miss school. This because I didn't like school and I dropped out of school and my mother and dad bribed me with a guitar. We'll get you a new Washburn guitar if you finish high school. So I remember being able to get out of school. I was at a Catholic high school at the time, Vincentian High School, and I got to get out of school for a couple of weeks and make Fish That Save Pittsburgh. And there's a shot. I got to be with Dr. J, who was a great basketball player,
Right.
and there's some cool stills from the film of me on the Clipper, the Gateway Clipper boat with Dr. J, and wearing a fisherman's cap and this cold '70s shirt. And yeah, I remember I was playing in bars in Pittsburgh and somehow heard they were casting the film. Someone heard me play in a bar and say, "Hey, would you like to be in this film? We're shooting in Pittsburgh." And my grandmother, who I called Nana, who's passed away, but Nana, I told Nana, this guy over here in the bar heard me playing. He said he's making a movie here, and he wants me to come up to the Hyatt Hotel to his hotel room to film him for a moment and read something or whatever. And I mean, I was just a glorified extra, but Nana said, "Well, I'll take you over there." I mean, she was pretty street smart, and she thought, well, just to make sure this is on the up and up, a guy's inviting my 16-year-old, grandson to a Hyatt hotel room. I remember it was the Hyatt. She said, "I better go with him." And so she took me over to the guy's hotel room, and we talked for a few minutes. He goes, "Okay, and here's where you go." And so I was just in a bunch of scenes on the boat and hanging out with Dr. J and watching the basketball games. And I mean, there's like 3 or 4 points where I can pick myself out in the film. You'd probably be hard to do unless you knew what I looked like at the time. But I remember like shooting hoops with Meadowlark Glimmin, one of the Globetrotters. And I love the Globetrotters. So this was all like quite a memory. And I mean, I'm like a blinker, you miss it. But I have a wonderful friend who runs a fan club for my work. And she has some of the costumes from Fish That Save Pittsburgh and some of the other stuff. She's kind of taken care of certain things from my career and stuff like that. So yeah, it was pretty fun.
Very cool. Yeah, again, that was to me an uproarious film when I was a kid. I was a big Dr. J fan, so that's really cool that you got to meet Dr. J.
Yeah.
So
Oh, they were really cool. They really looked out for me too. There was maybe I shouldn't say this, but there was a woman that was kind of aggressive and crazy on set sexually, and I was 16 years old, and she came up to me a couple times. One time she came up and she had like literally like it was a fish net. That was it, and I mean, my dad was in and out of a mental ward, and so he would sometimes bring home people from the mental hospital, and so I kind of had a good radar to know crazy, and this woman was like Fatal Attraction crazy. So I remember I was with Dr. J and several of his bodyguards, so I was with like 3 or 4 huge African American kick your butt type of guys, right? And she was coming up to me, saying very provocative, suggestive things, and I remember Dr. J's like, "You're really something. If I was 16 and that woman was doing that, man, I would be melting and she would have," he goes, "I know that woman is crazy. And, you're really wise. I mean, that's a big trap." Like he basically said, "You got some good instincts because that woman's crazy." And, but I just remember that like Dr. J and his friends were like, "How are you at 16 able to not fall into that trap?" But I mean, she just exuded, and I've been around crazy, and she just exuded crazy. So, but these guys looked out for me, like Dr. J and the guys looked out for me. Like this was before cell phones, and I remember one time we were shooting really late, and it might have been like 2 or 3 a.m. down there in Pittsburgh, and they were worried about me, getting home safe. And I remember Dr. J and giving me a bunch of dimes. This is like before cell phones. Like, here's a bunch of dimes so that you make sure
Make
you
a
get
call.
somebody on that
Yeah.
phone that can pick
Make
you
a
up.
call.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So
Yeah.
I highly suggest, obviously, if you haven't, and many of you probably have not, it's a film that it kind of faded a little bit into somewhat obscurity. It wasn't a big hit,
Yeah.
like I said, when it came out, but check it out. It's a fun film.
I remember it was some fish that saved
Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh.
Whoa, it's the
Whoa.
fish, right? I remember
Yeah.
the theme song. I
Yeah,
do.
because they were all
Yeah,
Pisces. Everybody on the
right.
team was supposedly Pisces, and Stockard Canning was an astrologer. And I happen to be Pisces. I'm born March 2nd, so.
Oh, cool, cool. I'm an
I
Aries, so
remember being shocked. It was almost like finding out there wasn't a Santa Claus when I shot with Meadowlark. We were shooting some hoops, and he was also into the Bible, and I was starting to get into the Bible, and he was a preacher, and he was really interesting to talk to about that. But I was shooting with Meadowlark, and I was kind of shocked. Like, we were just shooting, and he was missing some shots, some close shots, and I remember just being like. And now I know, like, they had a certain shtick as the Globetrotters where he could hit certain shots, and he was more like the clown of the act doing the comedy. And he wasn't like the great shooter like Curly O'Neill. But I was just shocked playing basketball because I thought, oh, he's a Globetrotter. He'll never miss a shot because, the Saturday morning Globetrotters cartoon, they never miss, right? And here I'm shooting with Meadowlark, and he's like making some, missing some. And I was like, I remember being like devastated.
How can he miss? He never misses, right? How can that happen? That's amazing.
Because I was just a kid, really.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is, again, I'm dating myself here, but yeah, as a kid growing up in the 1970s, all the Harlem Globetrotters specials and things like that, absolutely adored them, and myself and my friends, and so that's amazing. You got to shoot hoops with Meadowlark Lemon.
Now, by the way,
incredible.
If you want some nostalgia, you can go on YouTube and Google like 70s Globetrotters. There's like a wide world of sports of them playing in Howard Cosell, and here comes Meadowlark Lemon.
Right.
It's just like takes you right back,
This is going a little bit off on a tangent super quick, but there's an album called My Kids from, I believe, 1979, and it's kind of a disco-y album, very much of its era, but it also does have a little bit of a sort of a Baptist flavor to it, perhaps, given Meadowlark. It's a Meadowlark Lemon album, if you haven't come across it. Yeah, called My Kids. So one of my very favorite songs, it's just so pop song, obviously, it's super catchy, but it's Meadowlark obviously singing, and it's called the Po Folks Disco. So all the instrumentation in the song is actual instrumentation that you could just find around the house, and it's layered in beautifully. The production of the track is absolutely stellar, and Meadowlark kind of is more of a talking singer. He doesn't necessarily need to project. He kind of talks his way through it, and he just comes across great. He's very much in tune, obviously. So check out, everybody, Po Folks Disco. There's a related Ed Wood connection, very tangentially, so super quick. If everybody remembers Mrs. Stone's Thing, the film, the Joe Robertson film, Ed Wood appears in one of his later adult films. Obviously, the theme song for that movie, Mrs. Stone likes to swing, Mrs. Stone wants to swing, kind of a rocky type of song, very much typical of its era, 1970 or so. But the gentleman who headed the band that wrote that song, it's a band called Kent and the Candidates. So Kent became partners with a gentleman named Gary Dalton. And Gary Dalton, they became a group called Dalton and Dubari for a brief period of time. And they had other iterations of their band over time. They also started to produce a lot of music and write tracks for other people. And by 1979, Gary Dalton's actually the gentleman who plays all those found sort of instruments and did the whole entire post-production himself on Po Folks Disco, because I asked him about it. I tracked Gary Dalton down on Facebook and asked him about that, and I mentioned it to him on numerous occasions. Not like I know him well, but I think he probably thinks to himself, there's this one nut out there, this one obsessive nut who continues to mention to me, of all the things I've done in my life, he mentions Po Folks Disco. Right. Right.
Well, Meadowlark had a lot of nuances like Ed Wood. Like, here he was a preacher. He was a really good preacher. I got to hear him preach at the time. He preached at a church when he was in town.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, and I'm not judging him, but at the same time, he got served papers when him and I were shooting hoops for like a child support kind of thing. Like there was some weird thing where, you know, he had a son that claimed he didn't give him enough money or something like that. And like there's that dichotomy to humanity. Like everybody
Yeah.
has those layers. Like, so he's on the road, and like looking back now as an adult, you think about it, he was like on the road 90% of the year. You
Right.
know, those globetrotters were globetrotters all over the place shooting. And he did his best, you know, to send money home or whatever. But I guess like one of the older sons felt he didn't give him enough money or something like that. So I thought, you know, there's that dichotomy, because he's like this preacher, he's
Yeah.
trying to serve God, you know, he's this great legendary performer. And then like, but he has this family thing that's not quite right, you know? And so like,
Yeah. The,
there's all, there's,
our
yeah,
shared humanity, right? Our shared, regardless of
yeah,
what status we may seem to possess, how
yeah.
much
But I
money
remember
we
he
may
was
seem to possess.
devastated by it. You know, he was like, man,
Sure.
I've done so much for him. And, you know, why can't he just get a job or something? You know, like it was like a devastating thing. I remember.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Uh, so fish that say Pittsburgh. Let's jump ahead again a little bit, and we're gonna skip one more sort of lily pad before, because I want to close to give you an opportunity. I really want to dig a little bit more into Canaan Land, and so again, you can look up Richard's IMDb page to see lots of other acting gigs that he had along the way. Among them, TV shows, I believe ER. You were on an episode of ER, right? Among many other things. You'll find a really fascinating filmography, including, and I looked, as I said, he's in the diner scene. Where is he in the diner scene? So about a week ago, I watched the diner scene again, and certainly I've seen the film a billion times over. Are you sitting over John Travolta's shoulder when John and that's where you are in the diner scene? So John and
Yeah.
Sam are in a two-shot, and they're in the foreground, and they're talking. And I thought that was you. You're in the booth, a couple booths behind John Travolta. Of course, we're talking about, yes, Richard was in Pulp Fiction.
Yes. And my friend Bob Ruth, who was a part of the whole Canaan Land thing, because I did Canaan Land first as a play, a couple in Long Beach and at the Stella Adler Theater, which is Ed Wood territory. It's Hollywood and Highland there. And but Bob Ruth played a big part in my doing the play, and acted in my play version of this, which was like a precursor to me making film. But Bob Ruth was a much more experienced actor than me. I'm just like a glorified extra, but he actually, I think, had a couple lines as the diner manager. And
Okay.
yeah, he lived in Hawthorne at the time, which is, my wife is from Hawthorne. And that area, I knew that area from visiting my mother-in-law and sister-in-law there. And Bob Ruth was, I just adored this guy. He was like a character actor who's been in like 100 things, and he got the gig, you know, hey, there's an indie film being shot, and I was visiting or whatever. Hey, come down, maybe you could be an extra. But I think Bob had a few lines. He was,
He did.
I think it was a thing about don't shoot or something.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
a stocky guy. He's kind of
Right.
stocky. He's since passed away, but you know, I don't know how to describe him. He looks almost like a Oliver Hardy type almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. He does have a few lines in that the dialogue sequence with Tim Roth's character. Tim Roth pointing a gun at him, hands him the garbage bag, and says,
Yeah.
you know, get everybody's wallets. And he's like, everybody, I'm paraphrasing, obviously. He's like, everybody be calm, and this will all be soon over. And he's kind of clearly very
Yeah.
agitated with somebody waving a gun in his face. So that's really cool. I guess being on, it was super quick on the subject of Pulp Fiction. Any thoughts, any recollections of how Quentin Tarantino's become something of a, you know, a widely acclaimed auteur. So this is really only a second feature film. How did do you remember how he acquitted himself on set?
Well, he struck me as like really childlike, which I like. People describe me as childlike in the sense of like really excited to be creating. And, you know, he was like, I think he was someone, it's almost like an artesian well when you cap it and the water pressure builds up and it finally explodes. Like he had been into movies for so long. He worked at a video store down here. I think it was in Manhattan Beach. He just studied religiously every video in the store. And then he helped me out when I made this film, my first feature, Sister Amy. He which I made for nothing. But he owns a theater, which I call my film school, called New Beverly Theater. Wow. It's at La Brea in Beverly. And they showed my film. Sister Amy has the attendance record there. And it really like got a cult following by showing at the New Beverly Cinema. And the New Beverly Cinema was like a porn adult theater at one time. It was owned by a friend of mine named Sherman. And Sherman passed away, unfortunately. He was riding his bike. There's a really nice trail by the ocean there at Santa Monica where you can ride bikes on the bike path there by the ocean. And Sherman would ride down there every day, and he passed away on his bike. I had like a heart attack. And the theater was in desperate shape. And Quentin came in and bought the theater and said, hey, he shows like cult films, indie films. So yeah, he was really enthusiastic. I think he's like super, super talented, and he has like a lot of like low budget grindhouse, low budget movies in his consciousness that come out. I felt like when I look at his work, the one thing, and I hope you don't want to get mad at me if you ever heard this, but the one thing I think like is a little lacking is like sometimes the depth of understanding certain characters. Like a lot of his women are kind of like kick-ass, beautiful, tough women. But like a film like Sister Amy, like I really get into the depth of this woman's psychology, that she was a faith healer, but she still felt unloved, and she ends up like dying of an overdose. And like I'm more fascinated, I think, in a deeper sense into the psychology of people than he is. Like his stuff is almost like fun comic bookish kind of stuff. So like, but I tell you what, the film he made about Hollywood and the Mansons thing, that just blew me away.
Me too. I thought it was brilliant.
I took to that screening. I went with my friend Josie, who is in Canaan Land, and Josie barely missed being one of the victims of Manson because she was supposed to visit Sharon Tate. She was with Sharon Tate at the Mexican restaurant the night before, but then she had a migraine and didn't make it over the house there. But she was on the way there to visit Sharon Tate, and when the bodies were there. But there's a lot of articles about Josie's migraine saving her life and the whole Manson thing. But Josie was with me, went with me to see the Hollywood movie by Tarantino, and keep in mind, she's close with Sharon Tate. Her and her husband gave Sharon Tate her first role in a film over in Italy. Sharon Tate was an extra in a film. Josie's husband, Channing, was a really handsome magician, and he was a leading man in some of these European films. So they thought Sharon was beautiful and gave her her first part over there. So she was close with Sharon. And so Josie's not like a super like, break down and cry type of person. She's kind of a tough British broad, but Josie, I looked over after the film ended, and she was just bawling her eyes out.
Wow.
After that, and because I think, well, spoiler alert if you haven't seen Tarantino's film, but I think he made it that Sharon survives, like an alternate ending or something, right?
Right.
Yeah, and Josie was crying. I was like, "What's wrong, Josie?" And she was just like, how she just said how much she wished that Sharon wasn't killed, that somehow that Quentin Tarantino's version was true and she survived, or something like that. But I remember it was I think one of the only times I saw Josie break down and cry so hard like that. The only other time was when they forced Josie to leave the LA County jail. She was the chaplain at LA County jail and ministered to people like Robert Downey Jr. and Tommy Lee and all these people when they're incarcerated. There's a documentary about her jail ministry on YouTube called On Faith Alone. You can watch for free. But Josie, they made her leave because she confronted cops that were abusing the prisoners and physically abusing them in the jail, and exposed it, and they got mad and made her leave as chaplain. Wow. But anyways, Josie, that Tarantino film just really affected her.
I wish, Richard, I would have known that we were going to get into that piece of conversation, because a friend of mine, I haven't talked to him in actually a couple months. You remind me that I need to email him and check out how he's doing. I don't know if he still works there, but for a brief stint of time when he and I had talked about it, and he sent me some flyers from the new Beverly. He was a part-time projectionist at the Beverly for a while.
Really?
So yeah, you probably know him. You probably know him. I'll offline send you a message related to that. But he gave me a couple Christmases ago. He sent me a Christmas present, a couple of things, and one of the items was it was, the dog food brand in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Another one of like the Red Apple cigarettes in many of Tarantino's films. He makes up these brands as if they really existed in the world. So that dog food brand, Brad Pitt's character feeds his dog this dog food. I guess Quentin or somebody in the crew had made up as sort of a keepsake for cast members thing, what is it called? You hang it from your rear view mirror, car deodorizer, right? And it's literally wrapped in the plastic as if you bought it at, a mini mart on the little wire rack. And it's that brand of the dog food, but done as a car
Wow.
deodorizer. And he somehow, working at the New Beverly, he got his hands on those. And so it's a keepsake for cast and related folks. And he gave me one for Christmas, which is like a really wonderful keepsake for me, because I do love that film. Yeah, it's a small
Yeah.
world somehow, right? I'm on the opposite coast, but somehow the world is actually rather small in today's world, the way technology can
Yeah. Well,
connect
the
us.
director David Lynch told me one time about the unified field in
Oh,
physics,
wow.
and if I understand the theory right, it's that there's this kind of unity in physics, that to everything there's some sort of unity to it,
Right. Very cool. We have
Yeah.
so many other things we could talk about. Certainly David Lynch is another
Yeah.
amazing talent. So, and we will, and I'm certainly have an open invite here at the podcast, Richard. I'd love to have you back. We could talk more about a lot of
Oh,
these
love
things.
to.
So what I want to do now, though, we've been at this for quite some time, and I want to get to, I've sort of seeded the idea, and you've mentioned it on a handful of occasions. So Canaan Land, tell us please a little bit about Canaan Land. You mentioned to me, when we were talking on Facebook a little while back, the struggles of an independent filmmaker. So I want to hear a little bit more about making a feature film come to fruition. And I'll give all of you guys a clue if you haven't seen Canaan Land yet. It was acclaimed to a great deal, but also one of the first, if not the first, faith-based film that was under serious consideration for an Academy Award or Academy Awards. And I do want to mention also, so everybody knows, Sister Amy, that's based on life story of Amy Semple McPherson, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Amy Semple McPherson. That's the
Right.
cover. There's another version that has both I made a documentary about her and a feature film. This one has the documentary. Oh,
Right.
these are all my films are streaming on Vimeo. Like Sister Amy's on Vimeo. Baseball's Last Heroes on Vimeo. Canaan Land's on Vimeo. Canaan
Right.
Land's also on Amazon Prime and a place called christiancinema.com. But Canaan Land came out of a novel I wrote and a play I wrote, which Bob Ruth from Pulp Fiction was in and helped me get going. And as a minister in Pittsburgh, I was doing these healing services where we were praying for the sick. I was trying to experiment with a very childlike faith and pray for the sick to see if we could see healing, we could see them get better. And I had the idea to set up cameras and record if anything happened or didn't happen. And that's how I made my first film, which was called Quest for Truth. I think I have a copy of it somewhere, but it's on Quest for Truth's also on Vimeo and on Amazon, I think. Quest for Truth, expose of faith healing. But while I got involved in that, I ran across these fakes that were doing the fake gold glitter and saying it was from the street of heaven, and guys like Benny Hinn, which some of his tricks, he carries like a bunch of new wheelchairs to each crusade, and then he'll have older people that are walking slow sit in the wheelchairs in the front, and then say, hey, I'll give you a VIP seat in front, and then at a certain time I'll say rise up and walk, and brings them out of the chair, and people think they're actually like being healed and stuff. So like I saw all these fakes, and I had the idea to write a story, which is what Canaan Land is about, which is my character, Brother Billy. He is a fake. He's doing miracles for money. He's merchandising religion, and he falls in love with Sister Sarah, who's played by Rebecca Holden, who was on the show Knight Rider. Rebecca Holden's a sincere Christian, and my character falls in love with her and learns this con game isn't a game. And it's the whole story of her realizing he's a fake and breaking up with him and his journey to see if he can get faith for real. And so it's got a lot of people upset with me. I had church friends that said, you shouldn't be making religion look bad. And this is really, I had friends even detached from me, people that were supporting me that said, I can't support you anymore. But I think it's, Jesus in the Bible, he overturned the tables in the temple when the religious leaders were ripping people off, and the money changers, they had to exchange their money at the Passover, and they were charging them, high rates, or they were stealing from them. And Christ got out a whip and chased them out. So to me, Jesus is so different from the way a lot of the American church people view him, because he'd probably be arrested today for vandalism or something. I mean, he literally started wrecking the temple and saying, you've turned the place of prayer into a den of thieves. So to me, my film exposing these fake televangelists to me, I think there's scriptural precedent for, exposing the fakes. And
Yeah.
my character, it's a spoiler alert, but my character does repent in the end, and he does something that no televangelist ever does. He gives the money back to the poor people that he ripped off, which you'll never ever see a preacher do that.
I certainly it's in the news lately because they made a film about Tammy Faye Baker. But
Yeah.
one of the things, it's one of the more entertaining things in a perhaps unpleasant way that I've seen over the course of the last year and a half or so in my life. But I stumbled on YouTube a couple months ago, and I not watching the Jim Baker show in recent years, far from it, and he was selling these food buckets at exorbitant prices, and the food looked absolutely disgusting, like it was plates of slop. And he's literally acting like a total nut job as he's running his hands through hot, steaming things of rice and stuffing it into his mouth and telling everybody, buy 38 food buckets to get through the food famine that's forthcoming, and you'll be able to live off these food buckets. And then you can buy a toilet seat that fits onto the top of a food bucket. So once you eat all the food, you can repurpose the food bucket. And it's sad to me for me to think about how many people fell for it and bought all this exorbitantly overpriced crappy food predicated on some famine that is immediately forthcoming that still hasn't happened. Of course, I worry sometimes about food waste and things like that, but that is one example of what you're talking about. Talk about I'm familiar with Benny Hinn as well. So yeah, it's interesting. You think about charlatans, right? You think about the concept of a charlatan and how many different shapes that can take. Captain Zazita, going back to Captain Zazita, a really good example. He was a sort of fake hypnotist in his early days and did some, he used to do,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, in the 1920s, he started it, and he would travel around and go to different towns, and he would go to like, say like the garage or the tire dealer in town, and he would say, hey, Captain Dezita's here. I'm part of like this big car safety commission. I travel around and I do a 3-wheel drive. I drive a car on only 3 wheels to show you, car safety, to demonstrate car safety. And I do it blindfolded. I do this blindfolded. And he played that scam throughout the 1930s until he started getting into some more perhaps invasive scams, perhaps, but yeah. So I find it, when you say, Richard, that some people would want to sort of, since you made Canaan Land kind of keep you at arm's length, that's sad to me, because I have to realize, of course, that the reality of it is there are a lot of these folks out there who are downright charlatans, scamsters, etc. But definitely, I want everybody, please definitely go check out Canaan Land as well as Richard's other work. And you mentioned Rebecca Holden. I wanted to say, in the cast, I believe they have small roles in the film. But Cindy Williams, which is Shirley from Laverne and Shirley. We haven't seen her around in quite some time, I would imagine, but she appears in Canaan Land, as well as Sally Kirkland. And tell me, I didn't even know he was still active. And frankly, when I saw him in the cast credits, I thought, I didn't even know necessarily that Luke Gossett Jr. was even still alive. How did you manage to get him involved in the project?
Well, one of the guerrilla kind of punk rock things about Canaan Land is we would do all these things that, we didn't have a budget, but we would take, again, like my idea about asking the Pope about making Clemente a saint that gave my film all the publicity. Sometimes these off the wall ideas come to you. Well, when I made my first couple of films, when I made like this one, Sister Amy, and Baseball's Last Hero, I didn't have any formal training other than in Pittsburgh Filmmakers. I did take a screenwriting class there, which helped me learn about writing a script. But I decided to try to go back to school and get a film degree. So I got an associate's in filmmaking at LA Valley College here near where I live. But the professor who leads the program, Eric Swellstad, said it can really help a guerrilla film if you have some names. But the challenge is, how do you get names when you have no money, right? So, like you, I do a podcast, and I haven't been doing it as much lately because I've been doing the filmmaking, but I look back and realize, like, Rebecca and I both have interviewed people, and we had interviews, right? So Rebecca had interviewed Louis Gossett Jr., and I had interviewed on my Richard Rossi live show. I had interviewed Cindy Williams, Sally Kirkland, different ones like that, and Kathy Coleman, Kathy Garver, different ones. And I thought, you know what? maybe Brother Billy and Sister Sarah, as their Hollywood church gets growing, they start ministering to celebrities, and they have, like, a lot of these televangelists have a radio show or a TV show. They could have Hollywood guests on, and so in other words, I just repurposed old interview clips, but I made it that it was the Brother Billy Sister Sarah show, right?
Right.
So it's only like a blink and you miss it, with the celebrity cameos interview clips. But I was able to do what my film professor said, and it got some names in the cast, right?
Right.
So like with film festivals, they're wading through 1,000 submissions, and they do happen to see in the cast list you have a couple names they know. It just helps a bit.
Sure. For
So
sure.
so basically, all these celebrities are really kind to just give their permission for us to use the interviews.
That's very cool. And independent film, you've got to do what you can, not only to garner publicity, but repurposing footage. Very smart. That's very Ed-like, very Wood-like.
Yeah, yeah, just like Ed Wood stock footage. That's an Ed
Right.
Wood trick. Yeah.
Right, for sure, for sure. So I guess again, I kept you here longer than I had invited you for, but I welcome you back, Richard. And I think
Oh, thank
I
you.
enjoyed this conversation immensely, and we
Yeah.
went into a lot of things that I was not even remotely anticipating. So this has been wonderful for me. I hope for all of you watching, I hope this has been a conversation that I'm sure that you've enjoyed as well. So before I close this out, Richard, last thoughts, last observations, last words. Totally free forum. Anything you want to say?
Well, I guess if you're interested in Canaan Land, just go to canaanlandmovie.com. And I do want to say I'm starting a new film. I'm in pre-production, and I was really thrilled. It's called Lucy and the Lake Monster, about this little 9-year-old girl, Lucy, who believes in a sea serpent in Lake Champlain, which is a lake that borders Vermont, New York. And it's based on the childhood of a friend of mine, Kelly Tabor, who runs the fan club for my work, grew up there and believed in this sea monster and saw this sea monster.
Wow.
So the big paper there in the Plattsburgh, New York area is called the Press Republican, and they actually did this front page story on the fact that we're making this film. And there's Kelly who's co-writing it with me, and there's a picture of me singing the theme song. So if you want to keep up with our new film, it's in pre-production. We're currently looking for our Lucy. So we're getting all these auditions of 9-year-old girls, reading some lines from the script and sending in their auditions. But if you just go to facebook.com/champ movie, because the monster of Lake Champlain is called Champ. So just facebook.com champ movie, and like that, you can keep up with that new film. We've been shooting some footage, and now we're casting some of the actors. And like Canaan Land, we hope to get a couple names in it too to help. But at this point, we're looking for our leading lady, who's going to be hopefully like the next Shirley Temple, a 9-year-old little star.
Best of luck with that, Richard. I wish you
Thank you.
all the best on that project. That sounds fascinating, actually.
Thank
It
you.
reminds me real quick. Brenda, back to Ed Wood, really super fast. So Champlain, Lake Champlain, border of Vermont, New York. If the Champlain River actually goes up towards the South Shore of Montreal. So a gentleman who was friends with Ed Wood. I've told this story before on the podcast and on the blog, and you may or may not have heard it, Richard. But a gentleman who was friends with Ed Wood back in the late '60s and early '70s, and in fact produced a couple of his screenplays. I became friends with him in his later years, and at the time he was living in an apartment building literally a stone's throw from the Champlain River. So again,
Wow.
this small world sort of today's world is vast, and then what is there, nearly 8 billion people in the world, but it seems like more so than ever there's so many correspondences that we're able to uncover because people who previously would have never really connected with one another have this technological freedom to connect with one another. How we connected, and I'm grateful that we have. For all of you, watching, we'll definitely be back at it here at both the Faster Podcast, Kill podcast, as well as the Ed Wood Summit podcast. Continue to keep your eye every Wednesday out at the Dead Rights blog for new articles and new links to podcasts at Ed Wood Wednesdays. Joe Blevins this week just recently put up a really wonderful article on the cowboy star Bob Steele, who was in a couple of Ed's movies. So definitely go check that out and more at Ed Wood Wednesdays. Links to come in the description box of this YouTube video to some of what we've discussed with Richard and his really fascinating body of work. And again, Richard, appreciate it tremendously. Thank you so much for joining me
Thank
here.
you for having me, Greg.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as always, everybody, hope you found this, I'm sure you found this entertaining. And as always, I hope you found it beneficial. And I hope to see you back here. And thank you. Have a great night. Bye.